substantive election, you know, in terms of, yes, the election of '84 was important, but it was kind of mudslinging. Remember the Ma stuff and Cleveland having a illegitimate baby? Yeah, well, this is not. He's president now, and, you know, he is taking a laissez-faire, cut taxes approach. And as you can see, almost every time there's one of these, or virtually every time, it's a Republican policy until now. See, now we have, since 1970s, we have virtually eliminated tariffs almost completely. But very rarely will you see these anymore. So the beauty of all this story is that this is where it matters. After this, it doesn't as much. So it kind of in this 100-year window of the tariff struggle. Here you had a cartoon from the period. So you have an election. It's really important, you know, because it has to do with what people believe is a better version of how to govern, particularly on this issue. So the central issue is going to be the tariff. Now, Harrison comes in, and this guy Harrison is the, sort of, the cartoons you see depicted of him I always like. You know, they're funny because he's kind of small and he's wearing a huge hat. And that's because he's, he's the grandson of William Henry Harrison. And so they're basically saying he's not big enough to fill his grandfather's shoes. Okay. But what's really important to me is this, because this is the first election in my mind where it's not as much about party bosses. It's not as much about the spoil system. What's happened? What's changed? So, first of all, you need to remember that the Pendleton Act has passed, right? The Pendleton Act. So there was a law passed called the Pendleton Civil Service Act, the Pendleton Act. And that act meant it was going to be much harder, okay, much harder for politicians to get money from people. Because what they did is, in exchange for votes and support, they hook people up, right? Well, now these people don't have a vested interest as much. The more you take them out of the spoil system, the less reason they have to vote. So if you're Republicans and you're like, how are we going to find people who will support us? They're like, oh, wait a minute. We have people who will support us. We can raise $3 million. It's a lot of money in that day by asking for it from rich business owners. So this is the first time where corporate America, industry, keep in mind, this is the age of industry, starts shaping the outcome of the American political system. Now, they always had some influence, but now you're talking about the titans of industry. And so they're going to spend an enormous amount of money on making sure that their voters know, keep in mind, you voted publicly back then, that if Cleveland is reelected, then they won't come have work tomorrow. They won't have a job. So they're going to use intimidation and threats. This cartoon says, coming out for Harrison, and you have all these workers lined up, and this guy's holding a discharge paper, which is firing you. And this guy's holding a whip, which, if you read carefully, forms the word coercion. So the Republicans are going to get financial support to make sure that people vote, particularly in Ohio, particularly in the Midwest, where factories are starting to open. Your book says votes were bought for $20 a piece. You know, I hear about voter fraud all the time, and I realize that Americans have no sense of perspective about where we came from to where we are. They used to openly vote multiple times in one day, and they would be paid to vote.
Oh, I saw the video. There was a guy with a beard.
Yeah.
He would vote one time with the beard. He would shave the beard, keep the mustache.
Yeah. Glenn is talking about, I know the scene is, there's a scene in Gangs of New York, which is a really cool movie, but it's an election day, and he's absolutely right. The guy would come in with a full beard. You know, the really enterprising ones would have the beard trimmed to like a different shape. Then they'd have the beard cut off with the mustache. Then they'd have the mustache shaved. So you could vote 4 or 5 times if you were really smart, right? So this was, this was buying votes in essence. But they knew, they being the business owners, that this was a good investment. Because if Cleveland gets elected and he has enough pull in Congress, then what's going to happen to the tariff? What's going to happen if Cleveland's elected to the tariff? He's said it. He's campaigning on it. He's going to cut it. He's going to drop it a lot. There's no need to have this huge surplus, right? So keep in mind, if you're a businessman, the tariff is awesome. It means people won't buy other people's stuff because your stuff's, cheaper than their stuff. So the businesses are shut down, so to speak. And this is the first election, but certainly not the last election where that kind of thing is going to happen. Okay. Now, here's one of the cartoons I was talking about Benjamin Harrison. Not a bad person, certainly not an ugly person or anything like that. But, really just sort of a lackluster figure in the role of the presidency. If you were to ask what did Benjamin Harrison do as president, somebody would be like, I don't know who that is, typically, right? So here you can see him depicted by Uncle Sam under a microscope as being the smallest specimen yet, as far as presidential. You have yet again, very close election. You can see here that Cleveland loses the popular vote by less than, actually, I take that back. Cleveland wins the popular vote, doesn't it? Not that matters historically. Very regional, very sectional in voting. Keep in mind, Cleveland was the former governor of New York, right? Wins New York, got a different game going, but nonetheless, he loses. And so this man is going to be the fellow who really runs the country. This is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Okay. He gets an all Republican Congress. This is that 89 to 91 Congress. So he will be the most powerful figure in Congress. He is the Speaker. His name is Thomas Reed. They called him Czar Reed because he ran it like an autocrat, like a monarch. All right. And the Dems were using obstructionist strategy, that smart Dems would, things like the filibuster. Particularly the most obvious tactic was the ignoring the roll call. You got to have enough people in Congress to actually conduct Congress. So they would not say president, and Reed would call him president. Or he'd send the sergeant of arms out into the lobby and grab congressmen and bring them in. But he's not going to allow the Dems to obstruct what he wants to get done as a Republican Speaker. Okay? Now, he believed, most importantly, that they had to protect the tariff. Now, what's interesting about that is they're going to take it a step further than just protecting the tariff. I would like you to know, before I explain this, I guess I should have put it in here. I'll put it in here now. One of the great ironies of 1890 is the fact that rather have the tariff go down, which is what President Cleveland had campaigned on, the tariff is actually going to go up during this period. It's going to go up quite a bit, and it's going to go up because of the actions of this fella, who was a very popular senator. I'm going to borrow this image for now and then come back and find it later. This image depicts, in large form, William McKinley, the Archduke of Protectionism. And in 1890, he will get, that's a great cartoon. In 1890, he will have passed the second largest tariff in American history. All right, this tariff goes even higher. He's from Ohio, and the problem is now, what then do you do with the surplus, right? Because if you're raising the tariff and you have a $100 million surplus, what now? What would you do? So what Czar Reed did was, let's get rid of this huge sum of money. So they spent it on all kinds of things. Particularly noteworthy, they wanted to make sure to keep getting their votes, right? So here's President Harrison. Let me insert a text box right here and explain how since they raised the tariff, they added, billions to pensions for veterans. Keep in mind, President Cleveland had vetoed numerous of these because they weren't really going to veterans anymore. Now they were going to like cousins and kids and, you know, anybody they could spend the money on. What else did they do? Started buying up silver as a rejection of grant policy. So they're just going to start buying silver, huge amounts of it. This will also, by the way, make Western state senators very happy, because if they're buying their silver, that means the businesses are working. So they jack the tariff is about 50%, which is unbelievable. I mean, that's a colossal tariff. But they're going to spend $1 billion. They're called the $1 billion Congress. I should say millions here in the whole Congress. The first Congress in history to spend $1 billion. So remember, we were talking about, you know, Bush and Gore. You can make the money vanish real quick, you know. But what's interesting about them is they raised the taxes and made the money vanish real quick. So that's like, that kind of thought is very paradoxical. But again, they're not doing this for the, I believe, for the good of the American people. This was brutal to the American farmer. Keep in mind, the American farmer, everything they buy has a tariff on it, right? Just keep in mind, tariffs, even, let's say you're selling, I don't know, a plow that's made in America for $40, okay? And you can buy a European plow for $36, you know? Well, if you have a 50% tariff, that European plow, $54. So you're gonna buy the $40 plow, right? But what a lot of these businesses did was then they would jack the price up to like $48 or $50. So you're not only buying a more expensive item, you're buying an inflatedly priced item because of a protection tax. Does that make sense? It's like double whammy. And so you can't, everybody who's a consumer is having to spend more money on this stuff, particularly heavy machinery. Yeah, okay, $20 back then is, yeah, so they were paying people $550 to vote. Okay, I think a lot of people would vote if they got a $500 check. Gosh. So this is an example of where the world of the farmer had become. And I know that today when we talk about Americans, we think about farmers, while we're sympathetic, we do recognize it represents about 2% of the American population. So not a large group of Americans. During the 1880s and 90s, at least half of America were still farmers. We're talking like a sizable percentage of the human population of this country are going to be looking at this red, which means every year, they go deeper in the hole. What this says is farmers, this is called price parity. The blue is the years that farmers got better prices than they paid in average purchases. So in other words, they actually made money that year. Every one of these pinks or reds are farmers losing money, right? Because they can't hope to charge as much as they need to pay off their bills, because someone will buy a different source. Does that make sense? Like if you're a farmer who wants to break even and you raise the rates on your wheat or corn or whatever, and everyone else doesn't, well, then nobody's going to buy yours. So you can't break even. You have to sell low, even though you're not making any money on it. So that's going to be a huge problem for these agricultural workers. So into that vacuum, and I know this seems like a consistent part of our story, steps a third party. I have said since 1999, America is ready for a third party today. So many Americans are unhappy with the two-party system. It doesn't mean it has to be a permanent one, but it has to shift the dialogue. And America has certainly seen this history. Whenever the two parties seem outside the domain of what ordinary Americans want, then they get angry. So you have a brand new party formed called the People's Party officially, although we're going to call it the Populist Party. Okay, the Populist. I will tell you certainly, and you can look this up later, but President Trump, when he was elected while not as a populist party candidate, was certainly elected on populist ideas. We have to figure out what populist means. Well, it's kind of obvious. It means popular, right? It means what the ordinary people want. Now, I know most people would like to think that every candidate who runs for office represents ordinary people. The reality of that is not true. We believe that a lot of our Congress represents special interests, right? And that certainly was the case to the degree then. So you have a former Greenback Labor Party candidate. You guys remember the Greenback Labor, the guys that were a single issue party over the issue of inflation? First time I mentioned it, but I'll keep at this. So you've had a group of people who were Western farmers who were unhappy as early as 1870s with the two major parties. Okay, and so they want that changed. They're going to meet in Omaha, Nebraska, which is the birthplace of the populist movement. And they're going to do very well over the next 6 years, 6 to 8 years. Okay. Part of why the third parties are so useful is they start pushing major parties to make some changes. So what are some of the changes? Now, these are not the populist demands. We'll get to them in a minute. So this is more like just things you want to, we're going to go over all of these things besides the McKinley tariff again. All right. So you started to see ordinary Americans saying, during the age of industry, laissez-faire by the American government doesn't work. If I could put it another way, these things, be they the railroad companies or the industrial giants, are so big, ordinary traditional politics and governance doesn't impact them. They're bigger than the government. And whenever people feel like they're out of control, like they're themselves, like they have no control over their lives, they're going to get very frustrated. So these were frustrated people. And so even Republicans in Congress were like, we better listen to this a little bit. So they're going to pass some laws which they don't enforce. These laws are not enforced when they're passed. But at least they can be like, we passed some laws. So the very first law, and we're going to come to this in another chapter, next chapter, it's called the Interstate Commerce Act. It's the first attempt for the federal government to regulate a business. It regulates trains, how trains conduct business. Now, they don't actually regulate them. Ironically, they don't do anything to tell them what to do, but they passed a law. So that's step one. 3 years later, the same year as McKinley tariff, they passed a law against monopolies. They pass a law against acting and restraint of trade. That's what's called antitrust. So you have the very first antitrust law being created, which they don't use either. So they're trying, they being the Republicans here are trying, but it's not working. So bad, in fact, look, in the election of 1890, they're going to be hit hard. Okay? And so that sets the election up for 1892. And you have a very unusual event. You have a president running for office non-consecutively or non-concurrently. He'd run before, but now he's running again, ex-president. And you have Benjamin Harrison, the current president, running for re-election. So you have two presidents running against each other. Cleveland is very, very adamant that what the tariff advocates have been saying, and this is really, I think, interesting, is that with high tariffs comes prosperity. And Cleveland says that's absolutely baloney. Like, tariffs don't cause prosperity. So again, in 1892, this is going to be a major election topic. But the other issue is, of course, this populist party, right? So populists are in there. And so the good news is, I guess, is that Harrison has done such a bad job, and the populist states are often Republican states. So it means Cleveland gets a victory this time. The green states are the populist candidate. And this is a very, very unusual event. The populist candidate actually wins, keep that in mind, electoral votes. That's one of the rare times in American history where a third party, a minor party, actually gets in the electoral column. All right, so General Weaver is going to get some votes in several states, as you can see here. Also, though, you should sense that the Midwest is clearly turned on the Republicans. If Wisconsin and Illinois, Indiana, and slice of Ohio, if they're voting for a Democrat, you know now that this bloody shirt thing has been put to rest, right? I mean, these are states that were blue. I mean, Republicans were born in Wisconsin. That was the home of the party. So they're unhappy with the economy and what seems to them. And Republicans tried to shake down the public this time, but they weren't having it. You know, they were in such disarray. And then, as if life threw another curveball, and you go back and look at President Bush and think, well, maybe those tax cuts might have worked had it not been for 9/11. Because I'd have spent another $2 trillion combating terrorism. So, it's one thing to say, let's cut all these taxes. It's another to say, oh, now we have to fund a war. Well, amidst all of this talk about cutting tariffs, you have yet another depression. All right. And so this starts within a week or so of Cleveland taking office. Now, just like most depressions in history, Cleveland is going to be blamed for this when it absolutely wasn't his fault. Okay. But it has to do with a huge bubble in the stock market, right? And an even bigger bubble in land investment. And so, guys, one of the things about American capitalism that is very tricky is timing bubbles. You do not want to buy something high when it's about to go low. Some fools went out and bought GameStop last week before it collapsed, right? Remember, they had bid the price up to $500 or whatever crazy high. So some people started buying it around that amount, and later that week it was back to like $8 or something. So you do not want to be on the wrong end of a bubble bursting. So nobody wants to say that's when it's going to happen. So everybody likes to keep buying. And this is another one of those speculative huge bubbles. Our word for this course is over speculation when it comes to crashes. It means people become irrational. They buy stuff that they shouldn't. I'll put it that way. This was a crippling unemployment problem. It will last all of Cleveland's presidency. So if you think about it, from 1873 to 1897, half of that time period will be a depression. Okay, over half. That's not cool. And it has to do with, I believe, now this is my scholarship, not necessarily the books, because there was nothing at all regulating the stock market. There was nothing at all regulating big business. So these people could use the most brutal law of the jungle methodology when trading stocks and when engaging in fraudulent behavior. So that, just try to imagine, I don't believe in government ownership of everything, socialism, but I am a supporter of government regulation of it. Because what it means is that the public has an interest in these things not happening. This should not happen routinely in America, where millions of people are out of work, hungry, and trying to find survival. So that's kind of where you're going to see this issue come forward, is like people are like, we have to have help from our government. So you're going to see this topic for the first time today, and we're going to return to it on several occasions. The question of how to deal with silver. So if you're looking at number 71, silver had always been sort of seen by ordinary Americans as a nice alternative to gold because it was readily available. And so back in the pre-70s, you could price the value of silver and gold at a 16-to-1 ratio. So what that means is for every 16 ounces of silver mined, you could get an exchange rate of 1 ounce of gold. Okay. That is why Grant had demonetized it, because it was not worth that. It was way too little silver. Silver was worth much more than 16-to-1, worth like 4-to-1. So starting in the 70s, the government begins buying coins, buying money, buying silver, 2 to 4 million a month, but not releasing it. What this means is they didn't really go back on a bimetallist policy just to make silver states happy and to get rid of some of the money. They started buying up silver. But this is not bimetallism, not really. So we return to what is called bimetallism here in 1890. Gold and silver, two metals. Does that make sense? Yeah, so two different sources of money, you know, and again, today we don't really care like what's in the money so much. You understand, like what money's made out of. But during this period, the raw material used to make money was valuable in and of itself. So like you would see people chew on gold to see the salt and stuff, you know, like, but like this was real mining stuff. So that during this period, the Treasury was mandated to double really the amount of silver, and this is how they dispose of the surplus, spending all these millions of dollars buying up silver. But the government wasn't really circulating that many dollars of it, okay? And so what Western types wanted is much more silver in circulation. They believe that the problem, and this is an odd thing when you start to listen to it, but they believe their problem was not having inflation. So let me explain to you this. Keep in mind, most Americans in this day and age were not heavy consumers. You understand? Like, it's not like that shopping centers and Amazon, and you know, they didn't spend that much except on fairly high dollar items when they needed them for their work, you know, like plows. They believe, rightfully, these farmers, and I'm going to give you these populist demands in a minute. I'm not sure. I need to fix my PowerPoint here to have that in it. They believe that the biggest cost that they had every month or every year was their mortgage. Everybody hear that? The amount of money they paid on their farm or on their house. So if that is at a fixed rate, if you increase the amount of money in circulation, that means you take in more money, right? Well, your mortgage doesn't go up with inflation. It's fixed. So that means you have more money coming in so you can pay off your mortgage easier. William McKinley will argue, well, everything else will cost more, including the plows and stuff, and that'll just eat up any money you might have gained. We are still having an inflationary debate in this country about how much increase of people's money is reasonable. Bernie Sanders was saying the other day that during this pandemic, something like the major Fortune 500 CEOs have made, I don't know, $63 billion or some crazy huge number, while the average minimum wage worker makes $7.25. That's what the minimum wage has been for the last 12 years. So he's saying that should increase some and it won't be inflationary. Well, that's his argument, you know. But the point is that if people don't have enough money, they can't pay for stuff, right? So they feel like just give us more money because we're not consumers as much as we are debtors. And so as debtors, what should we have? The stimulus that President Trump and Congress did earlier, most Americans, when they got it, they didn't actually spend it on anything because they couldn't go anywhere. The pandemic is kind of limited. So you know what they spent it on? Their house payment. They actually got ahead on or they put it in their savings accounts. Savings accounts have doubled during the pandemic. So we're not actually stimulating the economy by giving the money out so much as people are creating a safety net in case next time around, you know? So it's interesting. So nonetheless, they want this money. Well, out of that comes this guy. And he is one of the most significant figures of the American political history, the American political stage. He is the congressman from Nebraska. He was called the Boy Orator of the Platte. His name is William Jennings Bryan, okay? And William Jennings Bryan is going to run and be elected on a populist ticket and serve in Nebraska. But it's very fascinating because he is an old style religion preacher style of congressman. So in other words, he is I don't know if you guys have learned evangelical yet, but fundamentalist Christian who delivers his speeches like sermons with lots of religious imagery and, you know, he very revival style. And so very populist, by the way. That's the kind of stuff people out in the countryside love. You know, they don't want some scholarly discussion on tariffs and, you know, bimetallism. They want to hear great lines like out of the Bible kind of stuff. So that's William Jennings Bryan emerges as the key populist figure. And we'll come back to him too. Here lies prosperity. And I think it's an interesting cartoon. So you have labor. You could substitute this now with a college student, right? And debt crushing them, okay? Here's their mortgage on their house. Interest is their, their weight being an interest-bearing bond on the road to pauperism. That's poverty. And they say enslaved in 1863, national banking system and the National Currency Act, right? Stabbed in the back in 1873. That's crime of 73 by Grant. Okay. Assassinated in 1893. That's the Panic of 1893, right? And then they list together John Sherman, who was a Republican, and Grover Cleveland and other traitors, right? So if you're an ordinary working class American, you don't identify with the political people in Washington at all. And that makes me think about Donald Trump, the ultimate outsider. When he got elected, had never held any office at all for anything, right? So we don't want another Washington type, is what a lot of Americans voted. Donald Trump ain't that, was he? So that's why these people are angry. Now, Cleveland is suffering from the reality of having a panic and being laissez-faire. Like, he doesn't have a solution to this. He is a very traditional conservative Democrat. And so when remember the largest strike in American history was the Great Railroad Strike up to that point. Well, then they're going to have another railroad strike. And this one starts in the Pullman Palace cars. And he will send in the troops. So just like Rutherford B. Hayes sent in troops to break up strikes, Cleveland is sending in troops. So if you're a Republican if you're a laborer or a worker, you're not seeing much difference between these two guys, except for what, tariffs, all right? He didn't sign the tariff that would have actually created an income tax. And also because he didn't think it was good enough. And he got rid of the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act. Now that's a big one. He got rid of the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, which means he stopped bimetallism cold. Why do you have to do that? Why do you think he had to do this? You have one of the most remarkable events in history. You have people figured out pretty early on, under the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, if it's getting money at the same ratio of 16-1, but in reality, 2 new discoveries of silver had occurred. So silver was actually only worth 32-1. So guess what people were doing? They were taking their silver money and trading it for gold money. You hear that? They were taking silver money and trading it for gold money. And so this fella is going to sadly have to, initially he rejected it, but have to go hat in hand and get bailed out by JP Morgan. The government is on the verge of collapse. The economy is in wreckage. Cleveland would never, in his original mindset, go talk to JP Morgan, banker, right? Big time banker. But JP Morgan comes to him and says, we will loan you $65 million, you being the federal government of the United States. We will bail out America, but we will charge a commission of over 10% interest, right? So this is a period in history where the United States has to turn to a private banker to be bailed out. You understand? You think that's embarrassing? Yeah. So, if you're looking at your study guide, think about Brian as this free silver advocate. When they're, and by the way, this meme is being tongue in cheek and saying Cleveland wasn't good. Cleveland inherited a terrible thing and couldn't find a solution for it. In many ways, he's like Herbert Hoover. He can't fix this. It also didn't help that he had cancer at the time and was practically about ready to die. But if you are an ordinary American, who does it look like he's turning to? Wall Street. People today don't like Wall Street. Now, I know some people do want to be stockbrokers and stuff. Like, everybody wants their pension and stuff to be happy, but they always blame the greedy guys. I can give you video after video where Trump bashes Wall Street when he was running for president, including his supporters, attacking Ted Cruz because Ted Cruz's wife was a Wall Street broker, right? So the point is that we don't have problems with these institutions when life's going good, but as soon as it goes bad, they're the first ones we blame. The only problem is America, there's often a tinge of anti-Semitism with it. And the populists are going to be heavily anti-Semitic. You guys know what that means? Who are our bankers often? Right. So all these problems are going to be blamed on Jewish people, particularly by the populists. Okay. So definitely know this. And because of this, Cleveland is utterly unpopular. And ultimately, he will be voted out, obviously, and won't even be the candidate next time around. Now, I point this in here because this is the period in American history called the third party system. So I'd like you to know, I don't think I talked about when we had a two-party system, the second party. So the first party system, does anybody know what that is? All right. Not before the era of good feelings, but that's certainly not a bad answer. It's right there. So the first party system, and, we look at these things and say, this is how it's easy to predict how life was going to go, right? So the first party system was the Feds and the Republicans, or the DRs. So this is the first party system when these two parties emerged as critical of each other, right? Era of good feelings, not really a party system since it was not really a party. All right. Only one party. Second party system is when you had primarily, well, I want to put you by the parties, but this will work. The Democrats and the Whigs. So first the Feds and the DRs, then you have the Dems and the Whigs, and now you have the Dems and the Republicans. Okay, so you can see the mixture of votes there. They're kind of a national party until they weren't. But it's been pretty sectional all along with some changes over time. Okay, so I want to go back now to a couple of things I have here, but because I'm going to be bouncing around, I'm going to stop recording and paste and move some stuff. So you'll follow me, I think. I hope. For some reason I grabbed, you'll see.